You have co-edited and published, co-editing with the Chinese poet Sun Dong, a collection of translations that's quite unique, unlike any other book of translations, poetry translations I've ever seen. Would you talk a little bit about how and why you and Sun Dong did the project in the way that you did?
Yeah, it is an interesting translation. The book, the Reciprocal Translation Project, just came out in the fall from Roof Books. And what we found in trying to work with translations was that we didn't get very good results from translating Chinese into English and English into Chinese. And no matter how talented the translator was, the Chinese was always, much of the Chinese etymology was lost. The Chinese etymology was lost in the translation because English simply doesn't have that depth of historical reference that a lot of the Chinese characters do. The similar sounds in Chinese are not replicable in English. And the value of English is often lost in Chinese in the diversity of sounds, the metrics and things like that that make English language poetry so interesting. So the things that were lost seemed so great that we said, well, let's come up with an idea that will circumvent this problem. It may cause other problems, but let's see what happens. And so what we did was we took 6 Chinese poets and 6 American poets and had them translate each other. Rather than having a professional translator in the middle, we simply created literal translations which showed a variety of meanings that were possible in the Chinese or in the English, and then gave them not to 1 but to 3 people in the other language, so each poem appears 4 times. Under the theory that you will get a better view of what the poet is actually doing from seeing it from multiple directions than you would from any single point of view.
And that idea of seeing things from multiple points of view and kind of creating networks or nodes of people communicating in new and different ways is part of a larger poetics or theory of literature, not just literature, but environmentalism that you've spoken a great deal about. In your time here, could you talk a little bit about environmentalism in your view?
Yeah, in this book, we created what I consider to be a kind of primary example of environmentalism. Instead of the linear connection of the poet to the translator to the reader, that humanist linear connection becomes a complex set of connections with multiple translators, multiple poets, direct address, and a many-to-many relationship, which looks a lot more like an ecosystem than a kind of logical progression. And so when I came up with this, I said, oh, this is a perfect example of what I'm trying to show in other ways in the poetry world. Because what the question is, of course, what should poets do about things like climate change and environmental issues?
And it's truer to the way translation and reading and communities really form, in that over time there are multiple readings and interpretations come and go and form and shape new ones in this complex way. So it's wonderful to have that represented in a book, and to encourage us, invite us to rethink what poetry and translation can be. It's an interesting move and a challenging one, I think, to move then from something like that focused on translation and poetry to this big idea of climate change, or what can poetry or writing do about anthropogenic climate change. So how do you make that move from focusing on poetry and translation in a case like this to this, well, global issue of such enormous complexity, almost becomes impossible to talk about?
Yeah, and one of the reasons that it's difficult to talk about is that we don't really have a good language for talking about the biosphere and ecosystems and their sets of relationships. That is, we describe our nodes, you know, there's the David node and the James node, and you know, we're okay, but what's going on between us? All of the different connections that ecology establishes are not well established in culture. So, for example, we have good science around climate change. We could stop it today with the technology that we have. Maybe a little bit more money, but certainly we could do it. We have political systems that in most of the countries of the world can do pretty much what they want to do if they chose to do it, but nobody really wants to change their minds. So the question is, how can culture help people to change their minds? What value does poetry have or other cultural artifacts have to help people to start to think environmentally, to stop thinking so much just about themselves or their friends as an analog to the self, or their company as an analog to the self, which is very well protected, and to start understanding about the connectivity that really makes things run.
And so even if you're doing something that might seem very small scale, micro in a sense, and you know, poetry is fairly marginal to most sort of cultures these days, it creates a bit of a network effect or radiating effect that contributes. I like that. Thinking about the sort of place of poetry today in many cultures, and I think this goes in many ways for China as well as for the United States, it's often quite marginal. You know, you're reading articles about the death of poetry, even as more people than ever are writing it, and you know, so forth. You've been very instrumental through Roof Books and through your own poetry and your own participation in an ecosystem of poets and writers and presses and small magazines. You've been very instrumental in language writing and language poetry. It's a term I know a lot of students will hear, but it's also one of those terms that it's very difficult to grasp unless you spend perhaps a lot of time studying it. But how would you tell a student who's got a pretty basic knowledge of poetry in general, is interested, knows some names, likes some poetry, you know, how would you describe to them, okay, this is what language poetry is, or language writing?
So language poetry is language writing, and I think people like that term better rather than refer to that historical idea of poetry, just say it's different kinds of writing, is a complex of many different styles that get pushed together, from Russian formalism to American objectivism to the New York School. All of those different influences kind of build into language poetry, where writers of my generation became dissatisfied of just speaking about things in poetry. And we realized that there was a lack of attention paid to the ways in which poetry was convincing, to the ways in which poetry made meaning that weren't simply semantic. And so language writing to me is those non-narrative, non-descriptive strategies that exist in poetry for making meaning.
And language writing started as, in many ways, a very American thing, right? Even as it's, as you pointed out, sparked by things like Russian formalism and you know, this kind of awareness of the complexity of influences and adaptability of forms and you know, thinking about that complexity rather than just taking for granted one sort of natural way of writing. But anyway, so it's an American thing to start with in many respects. Could you talk a little bit about your experience with the transference of some of the ideas that you talk about with language poetry to China? How has language writing influenced Chinese writing?
In 1991, I came to China because Chang Shiqing translated a book of mine with two other poets, and I did a book tour of China, and we found a group of writers who were doing something that they called language writing, and the similarities and differences are illustrative of differences between Chinese and American culture. The Chinese poets called themselves original poets, and they were focused more on the older characters that had deep etymological significance, where the radicals carried a lot of meaning into the larger character. And so they played with those, that more limited vocabulary, in a common way that they all shared. Poets like Che Chanza, Wang Fan, and Zhou Yaping were models of what the Chinese culture produced when they focused on language itself. That was quite different than the American model, where everybody had their own idea of what language was, and there were as many different styles of writing language, poetry in America as there were people doing it. In China, they were doing it together. And the strategy didn't last that long, but Jeff Twitchell and Jeremy Prynne put together a little anthology of those poets that I don't know if it's still around, but you probably have a copy of it here.
So you've come to China a number of times now over the years. On this last visit, what do you notice that feels like it marks the biggest sort of change, or what have you noticed that's really changed that's interesting to you?
Well, the Chinese people look very different to me than the people that I see in America. I think in America, there's a lot of worry and concern about changing government income inequality, and I think that the people, even the poets, are kind of an unhappy bunch. And I come to China and I see a very optimistic, forward-looking group of people, forgiving and energetic in pursuit of what they're doing. And I think it's an amazing change for me. I don't remember that contrast being so strong. So I don't know if it's the Americans that changed or the Chinese that changed, but the contrast now is significant. So when I go home, I'm going to be talking about that and say, let's be, we're alive. This is amazing. Let's do stuff.
Right. Well, that's interesting because you spend a lot of time thinking about things like climate change, right? You wrote a book too, Our Nuclear Heritage, and you spent a lot of time thinking about nuclear weapons. So you spend a lot of time thinking about real major threats to our existence, or at least our existence as we've known it. That can be very depressing. But you also seem to have a real optimism, and to be able to channel that optimism into publishing and writing and creating community around our ability to meet these challenges. Could you talk a little bit about where that optimism comes from, or how you view the ways we might meet these challenges? And climate change is a great
Climate change is a big challenge, and we may not meet it, but the only way to meet it is with optimism and the expectation of success. The expectation of failure is is not very useful. So I try to avoid it. Maybe my own metabolism is that way, so it was easier for me to acknowledge that. But there's no solution in the kind of idea that there's a limited group of resources and we have to keep fighting for them, or else reduce our expectations for ourselves. Because to me, the fundamental thing about humans and probably every other life form is this desire. That's the real cause of climate change. The cause of global warming is desire. And the heat of our energy is what's producing it. There's no way to undo that short of ending human life. Well, then there would be another form of life that would do the same thing, because every species is constantly manipulating the environment in order to survive. So the question is, can our rationality prevent us from doing ourselves in? Can our rationality temper our desire in such a way that we can find good workarounds? And I think, as I said earlier in our chat, that the the main issue that we have to do is change the way people think about themselves.
Right.
And while I've written a lot about, from the poetry point of view, about the science, the politics in a book called The Oligarch, and I hadn't really written about people themselves. So I'm working now on a book called Selfie, about identity and environment, and that's, I think, the important other step that I need to take to complement the literary, political, scientific, and translation work that I've done to explain how environmentalism works in culture.
So it seems, in a sense, then, that one place poetry and art and writing can intervene and help turn people away from a sense of hopelessness towards an optimism, a healthy optimism, is in getting us to think about desire and its consequences. And I mean, art can be very good at getting us to think. It's like where artists are sort of technicians of desire in some way, right? So that's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is trying to develop a different way of looking at ourselves, so that we see ourselves more in the context that we live, rather than just in our own fears and desires. Which, Dom, I don't know about you, but I think most people are dominated by questions of status, concerns about appearance, and trying to put themselves in safer positions, using less energy to get along. All of those things speak very directly to humans being another organism that uses reason, which Kant says is a gift of nature, to make themselves more comfortable, to feel stronger, to feel less threatened.
We're in China, and a lot of American writers, artists, thinkers, poets have taken great inspiration from Chinese philosophical and religious traditions, Taoism and Chinese forms of Buddhism, Chan or Zen Buddhism, as it migrated through Japan and then the US. And that's had a real effect on how people think about ecology and interconnectedness, and also the relationship of individual desire to the sort of effects that radiate out from the acts that our desire drives us to. So how do you see your project in relation to, say, Taoism or sort of Buddhist principles?
So differently.
Yeah.
The way in which Taoism operates makes very good sense. As observers, the Chinese Taoists were immensely successful. What I don't think works very well in Taoism is the kind of mystification of the connection between yin and yang. And one of my jobs, I think, is to start to detail those connections, what the characteristics are of the connectors between people, between the two forces, between different parts of society, and start to really write about those characteristics, which I don't think is very well defined, or if it is defined, it's defined in a kind of mysterious way, which I don't think is really that helpful, in that it kind of sustains the leadership in a way that doesn't seem helpful. The Buddhist point of view is also interesting, but I find that partial. That is, there are different ways of looking at nature. The Buddhists look at nature, as I said, as a kind of limited set of resources that requires that we scale back our desires, scale back our needs in order to survive in the best way. But there are plenty of people who see nature as a cornucopia that's freely available, and I can have whatever I want. And there are people who see nature as a cornucopia, but it's controlled by skills. So if I develop my skills, I get what I want. And there are people who think that it's just random, kind of a crapshoot, and nothing that I do will be particularly effective. So all of these different ways of looking at nature and looking at ourselves by extension, imply Buddhism as a singular and interesting, but by no means the only way to look at it. And like most religions, Buddhism wants you to be a Buddhist.